In 1928, a team of archaeologists digging in Peruvian deserts broke through into an underground cave and found hundreds of mummies. When they cleared the dust off their face and looked at them, every single one of them had the wrong skull. Not deformed, not damaged. Just structurally, it was wrong. Like they were built from a different blueprint. That is where the story starts. The desert in southern Peru, a region called Paracas, is one of the driest places on the earth. The air is so dry that organic material simply does not rot there. If you left a piece of food sitting on the ground, it would not decompose. It would just slowly shrink and harden over time, perfectly preserved by the total absence of moisture. This is what happened to the bodies buried underground there. The mummies that archaeologist Giulio Tello pulled out of the cave still had skin on their faces, still had hair on their heads, still had perfect teeth. Bodies were thousands of years old, but looked like they had been buried last decade. But the thing everyone noticed first was their heads. Instead of the round skull shape that every human being on earth has, these people had skulls that stretched upward and backward into a long cone shape. Some of them were so elongated and so large that when you look at the photographs of them today, your brain keeps trying to tell you that you are looking at something other than a human being. Scientists were not immediately alarmed by this. There is a documented practice called cranial binding, where certain ancient cultures would strap wooden boards to a newborn baby's soft skull right after birth. As the baby grew, the skull would expand naturally, so it got pushed upward instead. Over years, the head took on a tall, elongated shape. Many civilizations did this as a status symbol for royalty. Scientists looked at the Paracas skulls and said it was head binding and considered it was explained. But Tello and his team kept digging and eventually pulled over 300 of these mummies out of the cave. They were carefully wrapped in layers of fine cloth, buried with food, tools, and personal objects. These were not random bodies thrown into a hole. These were very organized burials carried out by the people who clearly treated the dead bodies as most important. The burial site itself was a sign that it was a specific recognized ruling class, not an ordinary population. Then in 2013, a researcher named Brian Foster got permission to take the physical samples directly from the mummies. Hair roots, skin fragments, bone pieces, teeth, etc. He sent everything to a DNA lab in USA. What's shocking is the results from the DNA lab made the head binding theory collapse. Here is the core problem. Wrapping a baby's head can change the shape of the skull. What it absolutely cannot do is change the weight of the skull or increase the size of the brain cavity inside it. Both of those things are fixed by biology, not by external pressure. When researchers weighed the Paracas skulls, they came out at roughly 60% heavier than a normal skull. Not the same bone sitting in a different shape. It was heavier and there was more bone. And when they measured the internal brain cavity, it was about 25% bigger than what you find in normal humans. These people had more brain space than us. No board tied to a baby's head can produce either of these results. You cannot add bone mass with cloth and wood. You cannot expand the interior brain chamber through external pressure. If the skull is heavier and the brain cavity is bigger, that came from biology, not from cultural practice. But that was not even the strangest finding. Run your finger among the top of the head right now, from your forehead toward the back. You will feel a faint ridge running down the center. That is the sagittal suture. Every single human being on earth is born with that seam, because the human skull comes into the world in separate flexible sections that allow the baby's head to compress during birth. Without that flexibility, the head would not fit through the birth canal. After birth, those sections slowly fuse together for the first few years of life. But the line where they joined stays in the bone forever. You cannot remove it. When researchers examined the Paracas skulls, the sagittal suture was missing. Not faint, not partially fused. It was not even there. The entire top of the skull was one single solid, smooth piece of bone, as if it had never been made of separate sections at all, as if whoever grew in that skull was never human at all. Because they were not born the way we are born. Head binding cannot remove the sagittal suture. Nothing can remove it from a normal human skull. It is either there in the bone or it is not. And in the Paracas skulls, it was simply missing. The DNA added one more layer. The mitochondrial DNA from the mummies showed mutations that did not match any human population anywhere in the world. The lead researcher publicly stated that they were looking at a new human-like creature that did not fit any existing classification. He was a senior researcher. He was a working scientist reporting what the lab results showed. And what the lab results showed was that these people did not belong to any branch of the human family tree that science has currently mapped. These people were also buried with gold jewelry and textiles woven with techniques far more advanced than anything that local tribes of Peru were producing at that time. They were clearly an elite ruling class, but they looked nothing like the people around them, and their biology did not match anything found in the surrounding population. So, who were they? Where did they come from? And why does the skull have a bone structure that no other human being on earth has ever had? To look for an answer, we have to leave Peru completely. We have to go to the another side of the world, back about 3000 years, to the ancient Middle East. If you open a regular Bible today and flip to Genesis, you will find a short passage that most people skip. It says that a long time ago, the sons of God came down to earth and had children with human women. The offspring were called the Nephilim. The Bible describes them briefly as giants and mighty men. That's just a short information mentioned in Bible, nothing more than that. But there is a much older Jewish text called the Book of Enoch that tells the full version of this story. This book was widely read by early Jewish and Christian scholars for centuries, treated as a real historical document. Writers in the early church quoted from it. It was considered important enough to be referenced in mainstream religious writing. But when church officials were assembling the official Bible in the 4th century, they decided that the Book of Enoch was too strange and too detailed for regular people. So they left it out of the final collection. For over 1,000 years, everyone assumed it was gone, lost to history like countless other ancient texts. Then in the late 1940s, ancient handwritten copies were found, hidden inside a sealed clay jars in desert caves near the Dead Sea. They were tested and authenticated as genuinely ancient documents. Suddenly, this text that everyone had written off as lost mythology was a verified physical document sitting in front of historians, and people started reading it seriously for the first time in over a millennium. The Book of Enoch says that a group of 100 angels came down to earth and integrated into human civilization. The book calls them Watchers. They lived in human towns and they started teaching people so many things: metalworking, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, knowledge that human civilization at that stage of development had not even heard of. They are also mixed with human women and had children. And because two different types of beings had children together, the offspring were not like either parent. They were something new. These were called the Nephilim. The text described the Nephilim as physically large, far more intelligent than regular humans, and naturally suited to rule. They did not have to fight their way to power. They were simply operating at a higher level from birth. They became kings and leaders of the ancient cities because they had access to knowledge and capability that regular humans could not match. The ancient texts described them building cities and structures that impressed and sometimes frightened the people around them. They were not just rulers, they were a completely different class of beings walking among ordinary humans. Multiple ancient texts give us specific physical descriptions of what Nephilim looked like, tall and striking features. And one thing that made them very different in the ancient Middle East, where every human population had black hair, the Nephilim had bright red hair. The ancient writers specifically pointed this out because it was very unusual. It was one of the ways you could recognize Nephilim just by looking at a person standing across a room. According to the legend, a massive global flood eventually came and destroyed the ancient world. Standard history says that this is where the Nephilim story ends. But in the older regional traditions surrounding these texts, some of the Nephilim survived. They saw the disaster coming because their knowledge of astronomy gave their advance warning. They got onto ships, loaded their tools and their records, and sailed away from the Middle East before the destruction hit. They went looking for a land at the far edges of the known world, and after that, they simply vanished from the written record. Nobody in the ancient Middle East ever mentions them again. They were just gone, and nobody at the time seemed to know where they went. Now let us bring this back to Peru. The Paracas mummies were radiocarbon dated to approximately 3000 years ago. That lines up almost exactly with the period when the ancient texts describe the Nephilim disappearing from the Middle East. The Paracas mummies had fine, wavy, bright red hair. Skeptics argued that the desert environment had chemically altered their hair pigment over thousands of years and turned it red. It was a reasonable counter-argument. So scientists tested the actual molecular pigment structure inside the hair shaft in a lab, not the visual color, the pigment cells themselves, at a molecular level. The hair was genetically red. These people were born that way. The desert did not cause it. The mitochondrial DNA from these mummies did not point to Asia. It did not point to anywhere in the America. It pointed directly to the Black Sea region and the Eastern Mediterranean, the heart of the ancient Middle East. This is the exact place the Book of Enoch says that the Nephilim came from. So you have people with red hair and Middle Eastern DNA who suddenly appeared on coast of Peru 3000 years ago with no migration trail or no archaeological record. They just arrived. Each piece of that on its own you could maybe explain away. Red hair could be a mutation, Middle Eastern DNA could be an unknown ancient migration. Advanced technology could have developed independently. You can construct an argument for each individual piece. But then you get to the skull. The skulls are real. You can go to the Paracas History Museum in Peru and see them right now today. The DNA analysis is a real documented study. The hair pigment testing is real. The absence of sagittal suture has been confirmed by multiple independent researchers examining the physical bone. These all are verified physical facts. Either we are looking at an unknown branch of human family that has never been properly identified and classified, or the ancient stories of Nephilim are not mythology, and some of them made it to Peru.